When I lost my husband, his family felt sorry for me. They shouldn't have. The headline stared back at me from the funeral program, printed in elegant gray script, beneath a photo of Amir smiling, in that quiet way he always did. The one that made strangers trust him instantly and me fall in love all over again every single day for 12 years. I remember folding the program carefully, tucking it into my purse as the service ended. Because even in grief, the words felt wrong, like a half-truth dressed up in sympathy. His family, his mother with her endless handkerchiefs, his sister Nadia, who kept squeezing my arm as if physical pressure could hold me together. His brother Tariq, standing stiffly in the back row, avoiding eye contact, had spent the entire week whispering variations of the same pity. Poor Aisha, left alone so young. How will she manage such a devoted wife? What a tragedy for her to face life without him. They meant well, or at least most of them did. Their sorrow genuine in the way family grief often is. Raw, possessive, convinced that the greatest loss belonged to them, because blood ties supposedly run deeper than vows, but they never once considered that the real tragedy might not be my widowhood at all. Amir and I had built something solid in those 12 years, a small house on the edge of the city with a garden. Amir tended religiously, 2 children who still asked for him every night at bedtime. A rhythm of quiet evenings, where we'd sit on the veranda sharing tea and stories about nothing important. The kind of marriage that survives because both people choose it daily without fanfare. His family saw me as the grieving wife they could comfort, with casseroles and prayers. The fragile daughter-in-law who needed their guidance now more than ever. But what they never understood, what I only fully grasped in the weeks that followed, was that Amir had prepared me for exactly this moment, not out of foresight or cruelty, but out of love so complete it left no room for dependency. He'd insisted I keep my freelance editing work, even when the children were small, encouraged me to finish the online degree I'd paused after Lila was born, opened joint accounts, but never questioned my separate savings, taught me how to reset the circuit breaker, and change a tire and negotiate with the mechanic, who always tried to overcharge. Small lessons scattered across years that suddenly revealed themselves as a deliberate map for survival. The day after the funeral, when his mother sat me down in the living room, still smelling of lilies, and whispered that the family would help me get through this difficult time, offering to move me into their larger house so I wouldn't be alone. I thanked her politely and declined. She patted my hand with that familiar mixture of pity and possession, assuming grief had clouded my judgment, not realizing I was already planning the next steps with a clarity that surprised even me. Nadia cried when I told her I intended to stay in our house, insisting the children needed their grandmother nearby, that grief would overwhelm me without support. But I saw the unspoken fear in her eyes, the fear that without me clinging to them, the family's claim on Amir's memory might weaken. And I felt, for the first time, a strange detachment from their sorrow. They mourned the version of me they'd constructed, the devoted wife who'd always deferred, who'd hosted Eid dinners without complaint, who'd listened to their complaints about in-laws and neighbors with endless patience. They didn't yet see the woman Amir had quietly nurtured into independence, the one who'd kept her own name on the deed because he believed marriage should never erase identity, the one who'd saved enough to cover 6 months of expenses without touching his life insurance. The children, Lila, 8, and little Zane, 5, clung to me those first nights, asking why Baba wasn't coming home, why everyone kept hugging them too tightly, and I answered honestly in the ways a mother can. Baba's body stopped working, but the love he left behind still works perfectly. It lives in us and in the stories we tell. They didn't need platitudes. They needed truth and routine. So I kept bedtime stories going, school lunches packed, soccer practice attended, even as relatives hovered, offering to take the burden off me by babysitting or cooking or managing bills. I accepted the meals gratefully, but declined the rest, politely but firmly, because every small refusal was a declaration. This grief is mine to carry, and I am strong enough to do it. His family interpreted my composure as shock, as denial, as the calm before collapse. They whispered among themselves that I would break soon, that reality would hit when the casseroles stopped coming and the nights grew long. They didn't know that Amir and I had talked about this possibility. Not morbidly, but practically, the way couples who love each other deeply sometimes do. He'd made me promise I wouldn't let anyone, family included, decide my future if he was gone. He'd joked that his mother would try to move me into their spare room within a week, and I'd laughed then, never imagining how accurate the prediction would be. Now, as condolence visits tapered off, and the house settled into a quieter rhythm, I began the slow work of rebuilding, sorting papers, meeting with the lawyer to confirm the will he'd updated 2 years earlier, naming me sole executor and guardian, updating accounts, enrolling the children in grief counseling at their school, all while fielding calls from relatives who wanted to check in, but really wanted to gauge how soon I'd need rescuing. Each conversation felt like a test I was passing without trying, my voice steady, my plans clear, my gratitude genuine, but my boundaries firm. They felt sorry for me because they saw a widow left vulnerable, a woman stripped of her protector. They should have seen instead a partner who'd been loved so thoroughly that she emerged from loss, not broken, but equipped. The pity in their eyes began to irritate me, not because it hurt, but because it missed the point entirely. Amir hadn't left me defenseless. He'd left me ready, and as the first month without him ended, with the garden still blooming from seeds he'd planted last spring, and the children's laughter echoing through rooms that still smelled faintly of his cologne, I realized the real tragedy wasn't my solitude. It was their inability to imagine a woman thriving beyond the role they'd assigned her. They pitied the wrong person. The one who truly needed their sorrow was themselves, for underestimating the strength Amir had helped me grow, long before any of us knew it would be tested. The first weeks after the funeral blurred into a rhythm of small survivals and unexpected revelations, each day peeling back another layer of the life Amir and I had quietly constructed away from the watchful eyes of his family. Mornings began with Lila climbing into bed beside me, her small body still warm from sleep, asking the same questions in different words. Why Baba's side of the bed stayed empty, when he would come back to read her the dinosaur book he promised, and I answered the same way every time, holding her close until the tears slowed, then rising to make breakfast because routine was the only anchor we had left. Zane was quieter, more watchful. He'd sit at the kitchen table, tracing patterns in his oatmeal, occasionally glancing toward the front door as if expecting Amir to walk through it with his usual, "Good morning, champions" greeting. And when the silence stretched too long, I'd pull him onto my lap and tell him stories about how Baba used to burn toast on purpose just to make us laugh. His family called daily, his mother with offers to cook biryani and bring it over, Nadia suggesting playdates so the children wouldn't feel the absence so sharply, Tariq offering to handle any paperwork because women shouldn't have to deal with these things alone. Each conversation laced with the same gentle condescension, the assumption that grief had rendered me incapable, that without their intervention the house would fall into chaos, and the children into despair. I thanked them, accepted the occasional dish because the children loved their grandmother's cooking, but declined the rest with polite firmness that grew easier with repetition. They heard refusal as stubborn denial, as shock still numbing my senses, never considering that I might simply not need the rescue they were so eager to provide. One afternoon, Nadia arrived unannounced with a box of Amir's childhood photos she'd dug out from their mother's attic, insisting we look through them together to remember him properly. And as we sat on the living room floor, spreading images across the rug, tiny Amir on a tricycle, teenage Amir at his graduation, Amir and me on our wedding day, with his arm around my waist and that same trusting smile, I felt her watching me for cracks, waiting for the moment I would dissolve into sobs and finally admit I couldn't manage alone. Instead, I traced the edges of the photos gently, pointing out details to the children, how Baba's eyes crinkled the same way when he laughed back then, and when Nadia asked softly if I was sure I didn't want to move closer to the family compound so they could help with school runs and meals. I met her gaze steadily. "We're okay here," I said. "This is our home." Amir made sure we could stay in it. She blinked, surprised by the calm certainty in my voice, then gathered the photos with a small, uncertain smile, murmuring something about how strong I was being, under the circumstances. The circumstances? She meant widowhood. The sudden void where a husband should be. But what she couldn't see was how Amir had spent years quietly dismantling the circumstances that might have left me truly vulnerable. He'd never let me depend on him for money decisions. We'd split bills from the beginning, each keeping separate accounts for personal expenses. A habit born from his own parents' arguments over finances that he'd sworn never to repeat in our marriage. He'd taught me to use the investment app he preferred, sitting beside me on Sunday mornings explaining compound interest and diversification until I could read a portfolio statement without panic. He'd added me as joint owner on the house deed early on, joking that if he ever turned into a terrible husband, I could kick him out and keep the roof over our heads. Now those lessons unfolded like a hidden inheritance. I met with the financial advisor he'd recommended, confirmed the life insurance would cover the mortgage for years, if needed, adjusted the children's college funds he'd started when they were babies, all without needing to beg relatives for loans or advice. The house stayed ours because Amir had insisted on it. The garden he'd planted still bloomed because I followed the watering schedule he'd taped inside the shed door. The children's routines held steady because he'd always shared the load equally. Diaper changes, bedtime stories, doctor visits. So I already knew exactly how to keep their world from tilting too far. Yet his family continued to see fragility where I felt foundation. Tariq stopped by one evening with a folder of important documents he'd collected. Amir's old tax returns, car registration, utility bills, offering to take care of everything so I wouldn't be overwhelmed. I accepted the folder, thanked him, then quietly filed everything myself. The next day, discovering in the process that Amir had already updated beneficiaries and powers of attorney 2 years earlier, naming me everywhere, leaving no gaps for well-meaning interference. When I mentioned this casually during a family dinner, they insisted on hosting to lift my spirits. Tariq looked momentarily stunned, then recovered with a forced laugh. Amir always planned ahead. "Lucky you had such a thoughtful husband." The word lucky stung, not because it was wrong, but because it reduced 12 years of deliberate partnership to fortunate accident. I smiled tightly and changed the subject to Lila's upcoming school project, refusing to let the conversation circle back to pity. As the months passed, their visits grew less frequent. The casseroles stopped arriving. The daily check-in calls spaced out to weekly, then bi-weekly. They began to treat me differently, not with less kindness, but with a wary respect, the way people regard someone who refuses the role they've been assigned. Nadia still sent photos of the children when she babysat, still invited us for Eid. But the hovering had eased, replaced by tentative questions about how I was really managing, as if testing whether my composure was real or a performance about to crack. I answered honestly. Some days were hard, nights lonelier than I'd admit aloud, but the children kept me moving forward, and the life Amir and I built together hadn't vanished with him. It had simply shifted shape, stronger in places because he'd prepared it to stand without him. They no longer felt sorry for me in the same way. The pity had begun to fade into something closer to confusion, perhaps even admiration, though they'd never say it outright. And in that slow shift, I found the strangest comfort. Not in being proven right, but in knowing that the love Amir gave wasn't the kind that left a widow helpless. It was the kind that set her free to keep living fully, fiercely on her own terms, long after he was gone. 6 months after the funeral, the house had settled into a new kind of normal that still carried Amir's absence like a quiet guest who never quite left the room. The children no longer asked every day when Baba would come home, but Lila sometimes paused mid-sentence to stare at his empty chair at the dinner table. And Zain had taken to sleeping with Amir's old watch on the nightstand, the one that had stopped ticking the day the hospital called. As if keeping time had become irrelevant without him, I kept the routine steady. School drop-offs at 7:30 sharp, soccer practice Tuesdays and Thursdays, Friday movie nights with popcorn. Amir used to insist on salting twice as much as necessary, and in the small repetitions I found a fragile piece, proof that life could continue even when the center had been ripped out. His family noticed the steadiness too, and their visits shifted from daily check-ins to monthly dinners at their house, occasions where they still watched me carefully for signs of unraveling, but found fewer each time. His mother would set an extra place at the table, just in case, then quietly remove the plate when no one sat in it, her eyes lingering on me with a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. Nadia stopped offering to take the children for weekends so you can rest, instead asking how my editing work was going. Genuinely curious about the manuscript I'd taken on for a small press that paid modestly but let me work from home. Tariq, always the most practical, had once suggested I sell the house and move into something smaller to ease the financial burden, but when I showed him the updated budget spreadsheet Amir and I had maintained together, mortgage payments covered, emergency fund intact, children's education accounts growing steadily, he fell silent, then nodded slowly, and never mentioned it again. The turning point came during Eid al-Fitr that spring, the first major holiday without Amir. The family compound filled with cousins, aunts, the smell of sheer kurma, and samosas, children running through the courtyard in new clothes. I arrived with Lila and Zain, dressed in the outfits Amir had picked out months earlier for next Eid. Simple cotton shalwar kameez he'd chosen because he said they made the kids look like little scholars. His mother embraced me longer than usual, whispering against my shoulder that she was proud of how I was holding everything together. But the words carried an undercurrent of surprise, as if she still half expected me to collapse into her arms and beg for help. During dinner, Nadia pulled me aside in the kitchen while we washed dishes, the clatter of plates covering our conversation. "You're different," she said, not accusingly but with genuine bewilderment. "I thought you'd need us more. I thought you'd break." I dried a plate slowly, considering how to answer without wounding her. "Amir didn't let me stay fragile," I said finally. "He loved me enough to make sure I could stand on my own if I ever had to. He never wanted me dependent, not on him, not on anyone." She stared at me for a long moment, suds dripping from her hands, then nodded as if seeing me for the first time. "I envied you sometimes," she admitted quietly. "The way he looked at you, the way you two decided things together. My marriage never felt like that." The confession hung between us, raw and unexpected. I reached over and squeezed her wrist gently, the first real bridge we'd built since the funeral. Later that evening, as the family gathered for prayers in the courtyard, his mother sat beside me on the prayer mat, her shoulder brushing mine. When the dua ended, she didn't speak right away, just watched Lila and Zain chase fireflies with their cousins, their laughter cutting through the night air. "I was wrong," she said at last, voice low so only I could hear. "I thought losing him would leave you lost. But you're not lost. You're found. In a way I never was when my husband passed." Her admission carried no self-pity, only honesty. And for the first time, the pity I'd felt radiating from her had turned inward, toward her own younger self, who had never learned to stand alone. I didn't offer comfort or reassurance. I simply nodded, letting the truth sit between us without needing to soften it. Back home that night, after tucking the children in, with stories of Amir's childhood mischief, tales his mother had shared over dinner, I sat on the veranda with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at the garden Amir had loved. The rose bush he'd planted the year Lila was born was in full bloom, petals heavy with dew, and I realized I'd been watering it faithfully without thinking, following the schedule he'd scribbled on a scrap of paper years ago. The small act felt like continuity, like proof that love doesn't vanish. It changes form, seeps into routines and habits and memories, until it becomes the foundation you stand on when the ground shifts. His family had pitied me because they saw a woman, suddenly alone, stripped of her partner and protector. They should have pitied themselves for never imagining a marriage could build something stronger than dependence, for assuming grief would reduce rather than reveal. In the months that followed, their attitude softened further. No more hovering offers of rescue, no more assumptions about what I could or couldn't handle. Nadia started calling to ask for advice on her own career shift. Tariq invited me to join family investment discussions, since she seemed to have a good head for numbers. And his mother began sending photos of the garden she'd started at the compound, asking which plants Amir used to recommend for shade. The dynamic had flipped quietly. Where they once extended hands to lift me up, now they reached out to learn from the strength Amir had helped me cultivate. I didn't gloat or withhold. I shared what I knew freely, because the truth Amir had lived by, that real love equips rather than encumbers, deserved to spread beyond our small house. And as the first anniversary of his passing approached, with the children drawing cards for Baba in heaven, and the garden bursting with the flowers he'd chosen, I felt not just surviving but thriving in a way that honored him most. Independent, whole, surrounded by a family that finally saw me not as a widow to be pitied, but as a woman who had been loved so well she could carry on without apology or need for rescue. The first anniversary arrived on a quiet Tuesday in late spring, the kind of day where the air smelled of jasmine from the neighbor's yard, and the sky stayed stubbornly blue, as if refusing to acknowledge the weight of the date. I woke before the alarm, lay still for a long moment, listening to the house breathe, the soft creak of settling wood, the distant hum of traffic, the children's even breathing from their rooms, and felt the familiar ache rise, but not overwhelm, a companion now rather than an enemy. I rose, made tea the way Amir always did, 2 cardamom pods cracked open, milk heated just to the edge of boiling, and carried the cup to the veranda where his garden had exploded into color overnight. Roses heavy-headed, marigolds bright as coins, the lemon tree he'd planted when Zane was born, already bearing small green fruit. I sat on the step he used to favor, knees drawn up, and spoke to him silently the way I'd started doing in the quiet hours. Thank you for the map you left, for teaching me to read it without you holding the compass, for loving me enough to imagine a world where I had to walk it alone. The children woke soon after, sleepy-eyed and solemn. Lila carried the card she'd made the night before, a construction paper heart covered in glitter and crayon drawings of our family, with Amir still in it, smiling beside us, under a rainbow. For Baba, she said simply, placing it on the kitchen table beside his photograph. Zane added a small stone he'd found at the park. He liked shiny things. And together we lit a single candle, watched the flame flicker, then blew it out with whispered wishes that felt more like promises. We're okay. We miss you. We're keeping the good parts alive. His family had planned a gathering at the compound that evening. Prayers, shared memories, food enough for twice the number of people. But I asked if we could keep it small, just immediate family at our house instead. They agreed, though his mother's voice over the phone carried a hint of disappointment. She still hoped, I think, for the moment when grief would finally crack my composure, and let her step in as the matriarch who could fix everything. They arrived just after sunset. His mother with a pot of korma she'd cooked herself, Nadia with fresh fruit salad, Tariq with a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider for the children, and the house filled with familiar voices and the clatter of plates. We prayed together in the living room, the same dua Amir used to lead, his absence loudest in the pause where his voice should have been. Afterward, we sat around the coffee table, sharing stories. His mother remembered how Amir would sneak extra sweets as a boy. Nadia recalled the time he defended her from bullies in school. Tariq admitted he'd always envied his brother's quiet confidence. When the conversation turned to me, how I was managing, whether the children were sleeping through the night, if I needed anything, I answered honestly but without invitation for rescue. The editing work kept me busy and paid the bills. The children had good days and hard days, but counseling helped. The house felt full even with one less person in it. His mother reached for my hand, then, eyes glistening. You've done more than I ever could have, she said softly. When my husband died, I moved in with my parents for years. I didn't know how to be alone. You're teaching me something even now. The admission surprised everyone, including her. Nadia looked down at her lap, blinking rapidly, and Tariq cleared his throat, as if the room had suddenly grown too small. I squeezed her hand gently. Amir taught us both, I said. He just made sure I had practice before I needed it. No one spoke for a long moment. The candle we'd lit earlier still burned on the mantel, flame steady in the still air. Later, after the children had gone to bed and the dishes were washed, his mother lingered in the doorway while the others waited in the car. I was afraid you'd shut us out, she confessed, that without Amir we'd lose you too. But you've kept the door open, just on your terms. Thank you for that. I hugged her then, the first real embrace since the funeral, and felt her tremble slightly before she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the edge of her dupatta. Come for tea next week, she said. Not to help you, just to sit together. I promised I would, and watched them drive away, taillights fading into the night. Alone again, I walked through the house turning off lights, pausing in each room to feel the shape of our life. Lila's drawings, taped to the fridge, Zane's toy cars lined up on the windowsill, the faint outline on the wall where Amir's coat used to hang. The ache was still there, would always be there, but it no longer threatened to swallow everything else. His family had come expecting to find a woman diminished by loss, someone who needed their pity and protection. Instead, they found someone reshaped by it, not smaller, but deeper, roots stronger, because they'd been forced to grow downward when the surface support vanished. They no longer offered casseroles with the unspoken question of when I would finally need them. They came now with open hands and open hearts, ready to receive as much as to give. And in that quiet reversal, I understood the deepest gift Amir had left behind. Not just the practical tools for survival, but the example of a love so secure it could release without fear, so complete, it could endure beyond its own presence. The anniversary ended not with tears or collapse, but with a single candle burning low on the kitchen counter. The house quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock Amir had wound every Sunday. I blew it out, whispered good night to the empty rooms, and went to bed knowing tomorrow would come. Ordinary, imperfect, mine to shape. And that the people who once pitied me had begun to see what he always had. A woman capable of carrying her own light, even in the darkest seasons. The second year without Amir unfolded more gently than the first, the sharp edges of grief dulling into something manageable, a background ache rather than a constant scream. The children grew taller, their questions about Baba shifting from when is he coming back to tell me again how he taught you to ride a bike. Stories I repeated willingly because each telling kept him present in the only way left to us. Lila started middle school that fall, her backpack heavier with textbooks and the weight of new friendships, while Zane entered second grade with a gap-toothed grin and an endless supply of questions about why the sky stayed blue even when it rained. I watched them navigate their small worlds with a mother's mixture of pride and quiet terror. Every scraped knee, every playground slight, every late-night worry about fitting in felt magnified without Amir there to share the load. But I handled it the way he would have wanted. calmly, listening more than fixing, reminding them that feelings pass, but love doesn't. His family had settled into a new pattern too, no longer rushing to fill every silence with offers of help. They came for tea on Sundays, bringing sweets or stories instead of solutions. His mother had taken up gardening in earnest, after watching how Amir's plants still thrived in our yard. She sent photos of her own rose bushes, asking for tips on pruning. And when I visited the compound, I found myself teaching her how to test soil pH with the kit Amir had left behind. The two of us kneeling in the dirt, side by side like old friends rather than mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, bound by obligation. Nadia's marriage had hit a rough patch. Arguments over money, silences that stretched too long, and one evening she arrived at my door, unannounced, eyes red from crying, asking if she could stay the night. I made up the guest room without hesitation, brewed chamomile tea, and sat with her on the veranda until the moon rose high. She talked for hours, about feeling trapped, about wishing she'd learned earlier how to stand alone the way I had, and I listened without offering quick fixes. Only the truth Amir had lived. That partnership should build strength in both people, not dependence in one. I always thought you were lucky to have him, she said at last, voice hoarse. Now I see you were both lucky. You chose each other every day. The words landed softly, a recognition that had taken years to arrive. Tariq, meanwhile, had started including me in family business discussions, not as a favor, but because he valued my input. When they considered investing in a small property, he asked for my thoughts on the numbers, admitting he trusted my eye for detail more than his own. I contributed what I knew from the spreadsheets Amir and I had maintained, and when the deal closed profitably, he sent a simple text. Couldn't have done it without your advice. Thank you. No pity, no condescension, just respect earned through quiet competence. The shift felt profound because it came without fanfare. They no longer saw me as the grieving widow who needed shielding from life's sharp corners. They saw a woman who had navigated loss and emerged not diminished, but expanded. Someone whose opinions carried weight, whose boundaries deserved honor, whose strength was no longer surprising, but expected. One crisp winter afternoon, while sorting through Amir's old notebooks in the attic, pages filled with his neat handwriting, grocery lists mixed with poetry fragments and reminders to buy Lila new markers, I found a letter addressed to me, dated 5 years earlier, tucked between the pages of a journal he'd stopped using. The envelope was unsealed, as if he'd written it intending to give it someday, but never found the right moment. I carried it downstairs, sat at the kitchen table where we used to share morning tea, and opened it with hands that trembled only slightly. Aisha, my love, if you're reading this, something has happened, and I'm not there to say these words myself. First, forgive me for not telling you sooner. I wrote this after my last checkup, when the doctor mentioned possibilities I didn't want to burden you with yet. I hope I'm wrong. Hope we grow old arguing over who makes better chai, and watching the kids have kids of their own. But if I'm not, know this, I never worried about leaving you alone, because I never saw you as someone who needed protecting from the world. You were always the stronger one, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully strong. I loved you by making sure you never had to lean on me out of necessity. The accounts, the house, the lessons in small things, they were never about distrust. They were about trust. Trust that you would carry our family forward, if I couldn't. The children will look to you for how to grieve, how to live, how to love without losing themselves. Show them by living fully, by choosing joy even when it hurts, by remembering that grief is love with nowhere to go. Don't let anyone, my family included, make you smaller to fit their idea of a widow. You are not half without me. You are whole, always were. I loved you enough to want you free, even from me. Keep the garden growing. Keep laughing at bad jokes. Keep being the woman who made me better every day. I'm proud of you. I'll always be proud of you. Yours, forever, Amir. I read it twice, tears falling onto the paper but not blurring the ink. Then I folded it carefully, placed it in the small wooden box on the mantel where we kept important things. Birth certificates, the children's first drawings. His watch, and felt something settle deep inside, a final piece clicking into place. The letter didn't change the past, or erase the loneliness that still crept in on quiet nights. But it confirmed what I'd begun to understand. His family's pity had been misplaced. Not because I was unbreakable, but because Amir had spent our marriage building me into someone who didn't need to be pitied. They had mourned for the version of me they expected to shatter. They should have celebrated the woman he'd helped create. One capable of holding grief and joy in the same hands, of raising children with love and honesty, of standing beside them not as a dependent, but as an equal. When Nadia called later that week asking if I wanted to join her for coffee, just us, I said yes, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. We met at the small cafe near my house, talked about her separation papers she'd finally filed, about my new editing contract with a publisher who wanted a full series, about the children and the garden and the way life keeps moving even when it hurts. She listened without interrupting, then reached across the table. You were right, she said. About everything. Thank you for showing me it's possible. I squeezed her hand back. No words needed. The pity that once filled their eyes had transformed into something warmer, truer, admiration, perhaps even gratitude for the example Amir and I had set together. As I walked home that afternoon, sun low and golden, the house waiting with lights already on because I'd set the timer, I realized the greatest gift of his love wasn't the independence he prepared me for. It was the certainty that I had always been enough. Even before loss came to prove it, his family no longer felt sorry for me, and neither did I. The third year brought a subtle but undeniable shift, the way seasons change, not with drama, but with the slow turning of leaves or the lengthening of days. Grief no longer arrived in sudden waves that stole my breath, but in quiet reminders. Leela's first period that Amir would have handled with gentle humor and a trip to buy supplies. Zane's science fair project on plant growth that he presented with the same earnest pride Amir used to show when explaining how to graft a rose stem. I managed both alone, not perfectly, but adequately. Texting Nadia for advice on cramps and buying the right soil mix from the nursery Amir had favored, turning what could have been moments of overwhelming absence into small triumphs of continuity. The children had grown into their grief the way children do, incorporating it rather than being consumed by it. Lila kept a small notebook of Baba memories she added to sporadically. Zane wore Amir's old watch on a chain around his neck for school presentations so Baba can see me win. They no longer needed me to fill every silence. They filled some themselves, talking about him openly, laughing at his quirks, crying when the missing hit hard, and I let them, knowing Amir would have wanted them to feel it all without shame. His family had stopped treating me like fragile glass long ago. Sunday teas at the compound became genuinely companionable. Conversations drifting from recipes to politics to the children's latest achievements without anyone glancing sideways to check if I was coping. His mother had started a small rose cutting exchange with neighbors, proudly showing me photos of gardens blooming from slips she'd taken from our yard, crediting Amir's original plants as the source. He gave us all this beauty, she said one afternoon while we sat in her courtyard sipping tea, and you kept it alive so we could share it. The words carried no pity, only gratitude. And I realized how far we'd traveled from the days when she'd pressed extra food into my hands with worried eyes, convinced I couldn't feed myself properly without her son. Nadia's divorce had finalized the previous winter. She'd moved into a small apartment near the university, where she now taught part-time art classes, a space filled with her own paintings and no one else's expectations. She came over more often now, not to rescue, but to be rescued in small ways, asking me to help her sort through old photos for a gallery submission, borrowing books from Amir's collection that still lined our shelves, sitting with me on the veranda while the children played in the garden, and admitting how much she'd learned from watching me navigate widowhood without losing myself. I used to think strength meant enduring silently, she confessed one evening, as fireflies began to flicker. You showed me it means choosing. Choosing to stay in your house, choosing to say no to help you don't need, choosing to keep living even when it hurts. I didn't correct her. I simply poured more tea and let the silence hold the truth between us. Tariq had remarried quietly the year before, a kind woman named Sarah, who worked as a pediatric nurse and brought a warmth to family gatherings that had been missing since Amir's passing. She treated me not as the tragic sister-in-law, but as an equal, asking about my editing projects with real interest, sharing stories from the hospital that reminded me life went on in all its messy beauty. When they hosted a small barbecue for Eid, Sarah pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, Tariq talks about you with so much respect. He says you're the one who kept the family from falling apart after Amir, not by holding everything together for them, but by showing them how to hold themselves together. The compliment landed without expectation of modesty. I thanked her, feeling the weight of it settle comfortably rather than heavily. That night, as fireworks lit the sky and the children ran around with sparklers, I stood beside his mother on the balcony watching them. She slipped her arm through mine, not to support me, but simply to share the moment. I used to pray you'd find another husband, she admitted quietly. I thought that was the only way you'd be happy again. Now I see happiness isn't about replacing him. It's about carrying what he gave you and making more of it. I rested my head briefly against her shoulder. He gave me enough to last several lifetimes, I said. She squeezed my arm. And you're using every bit of it. The years had stripped away the illusions they once held, that widowhood meant perpetual fragility, that family duty required constant intervention, that grief would always eclipse everything else. In their place stood something truer, mutual respect, born from witnessing resilience they hadn't expected, strength they hadn't imagined, independence they hadn't prepared for, but now admired. They no longer felt sorry for me because there was nothing left to pity. The woman they once saw as broken had proven herself whole in ways that challenged their own definitions of loss and recovery. Back home later that night, after the children were asleep with sparklers extinguished and cheeks flushed from excitement, I walked through the quiet rooms. Lila's sketches covering one wall, Zane's science trophies on the shelf, Amir's photograph on the mantel, smiling the same gentle smile, and felt the house embrace me the way it always had. Not as a shrine to what was lost, but as a living space for what continued. I opened the small wooden box on the mantel, touched the letter he'd written years ago, and whispered thanks into the stillness, not for surviving, but for thriving in a way that honored every lesson he'd taught, every choice he'd encouraged, every quiet act of love that had prepared me for this exact moment. His family had once pitied the widow they thought they saw. Now they celebrated the woman who had always been there, fully formed, fully capable, fully alive even in the aftermath of the greatest loss. And in that celebration, the circle closed, not with sorrow, but with the quiet, enduring power of a love that had equipped rather than enclosed, that had released rather than restrained, that had left behind, not a void to be filled, but a foundation strong enough to build an entirely new chapter upon. The fourth year slipped in almost unnoticed, marked not by dramatic milestones, but by the gentle accumulation of ordinary days that somehow added up to something solid and unshakable. Lila turned 13 that summer, her voice carrying the first hints of teenage certainty. Her room, now lined with posters of bands I barely recognized, and sketchbooks filled with portraits that captured people's expressions with startling accuracy. Expressions she'd learned to read from watching me navigate the years after Amir. She still kept his photograph on her desk, sometimes talking to it before big tests, or when friends let her down. And I never interrupted those one-sided conversations, because they felt like the private bridge she needed between what was and what continued to be. Zayn, at 9, had discovered astronomy. He dragged the small telescope Amir had bought him for his 6th birthday onto the veranda on clear nights, pointing out constellations with the same patient enthusiasm his father once used to explain how to stake tomato plants. Baba would have loved this, he'd say matter-of-factly, and I'd agree, pulling a blanket around his shoulders against the night chill. Feeling Amir's presence most strongly in those quiet shared moments, when the sky felt close enough to touch. His family had woven themselves into our lives differently now, no longer as rescuers or overseers, but as true companions in the ongoing story. His mother had downsized to a smaller apartment near Nadia's building, insisting the big compound felt too empty without her husband and son. She spent afternoons teaching neighborhood children how to plant seeds, using cuttings from our garden as starters, proudly telling them the story of my son's roses that had spread across half the city block. She called me weekly, not to check if I was managing, but to share small triumphs, a new bloom, a child who'd learned to water properly, a recipe she'd adapted from one Amir used to love. You should come try it, she'd say. And I would, bringing the children so they could see their grandmother in her own small kingdom, no longer defined by loss, but by creation. Nadia had started dating again, slowly, cautiously. A fellow teacher named Kareem, who brought books as gifts and listened more than he spoke. She'd confide in me over late-night calls or weekend lunches, asking questions about boundaries, about knowing when to trust, about building something that didn't require losing yourself. You make it look easy, she said once, stirring sugar into her tea with unnecessary vigor. It isn't easy, I replied. It's just possible. Amir showed me it was possible. She nodded, eyes thoughtful. He showed all of us, really. We just didn't see it until you lived it. Tariq and Sarah had welcomed a daughter the previous year, little Amina, named after Amir's favorite aunt, and family gatherings now included the soft babble of an infant, alongside the older children's games. Sarah often sought me out during visits, asking practical questions about balancing work and motherhood, about keeping a marriage steady when life got loud. Tariq says you're the one who taught him how to be a better partner, she confided once while we watched the kids play in the courtyard. He learned from watching you and Amir, how you decided things together, how you never made each other smaller. I smiled at that, thinking how strange it was that the lessons Amir and I had lived privately had rippled outward, touching lives we never intended to influence. One evening in late autumn, after a family dinner where laughter came easily and no one hovered or pitied, his mother pulled me aside in the hallway while the others cleared plates. She held a small envelope in her hands, edges worn as if it had been carried for years. I found this when I was packing to move, she said quietly. It was in Amir's old desk drawer at the compound. He must have written it before, I think you should have it. Inside was another letter, shorter than the one I'd found years earlier, dated just months before his diagnosis. Amy, if I'm gone, please don't try to take care of Aisha the way you think she needs. She doesn't need taking care of. She needs space to breathe, to grieve, to keep building the life we started together. Don't pity her. Celebrate her. She's stronger than any of us ever gave her credit for. And if you let her show you, she'll teach you things about love and loss that none of us learned in time. Love her like a daughter, not like a project. Let her lead. She knows the way. Your son, Amir. I read it standing in the hallway, the sounds of family life filtering through from the dining room, Leela's laugh, Zayn's excited voice explaining something to Amina, Tariq's low chuckle. His mother watched my face, eyes shining but steady. He knew, she whispered. Even then, he knew you'd be the one to carry us forward. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into my pocket. He knew all of us, I said. He just trusted me to remember it out loud. She reached up and touched my cheek, the gesture soft and final. I'm not sorry for you anymore, she said. I'm grateful for you. The words closed a circle I hadn't realized was still open. Back home that night, after the children were asleep and the house settled into its familiar quiet, I added the new letter to the wooden box beside the first one. The garden lights glowed softly through the window, roses nodding in the breeze, lemon tree leaves rustling like whispered secrets. I sat on the veranda, Amir's favorite spot, and let the night wrap around me, feeling not the absence of him, but the fullness of what he'd left. Children who remembered him with love instead of fear. A family that had learned to see strength where they once saw fragility. A life that continued not despite loss, but through it, shaped by choices made long before the ground shifted. His family no longer felt sorry for me, because there was nothing left to forgive, nothing left to rescue, nothing left to prove. They saw what Amir had always seen, a woman who had been loved completely, who had loved completely in return, and who now carried that love forward, not as a burden, but as light. And in that light, the years ahead stretched not as empty spaces to fill, but as open ground, ready for whatever we chose to plant next. The 5th anniversary fell on a mild October morning, the kind where the air carries the first hint of winter, but still holds the warmth of lingering summer. And the house woke slowly to sunlight, filtering through curtains Amir had chosen because he said they made every room feel like morning. I rose early, made tea the old way, cardamom, milk heated just right, and carried it to the veranda, where the garden had become something more than plants and soil. It was a living archive of every season we'd weathered together and apart. The lemon tree bore heavy fruit now, branches bowing under the weight, roses climbed higher than the fence, marigolds spilled across the path in defiant yellow, and the small bench Amir had built from scrap wood still sat under the jasmine trellis, weathered but sturdy. I sat there with my tea, watching dew glisten on leaves, and felt the familiar pull of memory, not sharp enough to cut anymore, but deep enough to root. The children joined me soon after. Lila, now 15, hair longer than mine ever was at her age, carrying a small notebook she'd started filling with poems inspired by her father's old journals. Zane, 11, telescope slung over his shoulder even though the sun had risen, eager to show me the new star chart he'd printed for a school project. They sat on either side of me without speaking at first, the three of us breathing the same quiet air. Then Lila opened her notebook and read aloud, in a voice steady and clear, a short piece about a man who planted seeds knowing he might never see them bloom, but trusting the soil and the rain and the hands that would tend them after him. When she finished, Zane added simply, Baba's garden is still growing. That means he's still here. I pulled them close, kissed the tops of their heads, and whispered, He's in every bloom, every laugh, every question you ask. He's in us. We spent the morning the way we always did on this date. Not in solemn ritual, but in gentle remembering. Baking Amir's favorite almond cookies, burning the first batch on purpose, because that's how he used to do it. Looking through old photos without tears, telling stories that made us laugh until our sides hurt. His family arrived in the afternoon, not with pity or heavy casseroles, but with open arms and lighter hearts. His mother brought a single cutting from her own garden, a new variety of rose she'd named Amir's Light because its petals glowed pale gold at dusk. Nadia came with Kareem, their hands linked casually. Her smile, easy in a way it hadn't been in years. Tariq and Sarah brought little Amina, now toddling confidently, clutching a toy truck Zane had outgrown and passed down. We gathered in the garden, blankets spread under the lemon tree, plates of food passed hand to hand, children chasing each other through the paths Amir had laid out years ago. No one spoke of loss as tragedy anymore. Instead, they spoke of legacy, of how one man's quiet choices had rippled outward to shape marriages, raise children, heal old wounds. His mother sat beside me on the bench, watching the scene unfold. I used to feel sorry for you, she said softly. No apology in her tone, only truth. I thought you'd been left with nothing but echoes. Now I see you were left with everything. Everything he ever believed you could carry. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman who had once tried to gather me into her arms like a child, now sitting as an equal, eyes clear and proud. You all thought that, I said gently, but Amir never did. He saw me whole from the beginning. She nodded slowly, and because he did, we learned to see it too. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the garden gold, Nadia found me by the roses. She held out a small envelope. Kareem and I are getting married next spring, she said. We want you to stand with us, not as family obligation, but because you showed me what real partnership looks like. I took the envelope, felt the weight of the invitation inside, and hugged her tightly. I'd be honored, I whispered. When everyone had gone, leaving behind laughter, empty plates, the faint scent of jasmine and cardamom, I walked through the house one last time before bed. The wooden box on the mantel held both letters now, side by side. Amir's photograph smiled from its frame, unchanged, eternal. I touched the glass lightly. You were right, I said aloud to the quiet rooms. They didn't need to feel sorry for me. None of us did. The years had proven it over and over, not in grand gestures or dramatic reversals, but in the steady accumulation of days lived fully, choices made deliberately, love carried forward without apology. His family had once pitied a widow they thought fate had diminished. Now they celebrated a woman fate had revealed. Strong not despite loss, but because of the love that had prepared her for it. And in that celebration, the story completed itself. Not with an ending, but with a continuation. Children growing, gardens blooming, relationships healing. A life no longer defined by what was taken, but by what endured. I turned off the lights, climbed the stairs to bed, and slept deeply, the house around me breathing in rhythm with my own steady heart. Tomorrow would come, ordinary, beautiful, mine, and I would meet it the way Amir always knew I could. Whole, unafraid, and deeply loved, even across the silence between worlds.